Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to present and for the amazing Saturday afternoon. I found it so useful and helpful, particularly at the moment where I'm trying to write up the end of my PhD. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about a guided critical reflection that on my own research practice within my PhD study. And we're writing this up as a paper at the moment, so hopefully it'll get into a journal at some point soon. So basically, my PhD is a participatory action research approach to look at the perspectives and lived experiences of separated young people who are living in northern France. And it's really looking at the transition to adulthood for these young people. 12 separated young people from a département in France, which is basically including Dunkirk, Lille, places like Douai. It's just on the border with Belgium. And they all come originally from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly West African countries. So firstly, who are separated young people? Because not everybody knows. So separated children, which is the term that separated young people come from, are children who are under the age of 18 and who are recognized by the state as being under the age of 18, who are outside their country of origin and separated from both their parents or their previous caregivers. So it's often interchanged with unaccompanied minors, but I'm using separated children because it's a little bit more inclusive. But they're actually not children, they're young people aged 18 to 24 because we're looking at the transition to adulthood, and this is going from the UNESCO definitions. Just as well, if I go over time, please tell me, just in case. So just to give you a quick idea of the data collection, so it ran from 2018 to summer 2019, November 2018 to July 2019. And it kind of went through four processes. So firstly, it was researcher-led. The aim was to have the young people as involved as possible from the start. But this was quite complex, particularly due to ethical procedures with the institution and the research proposals. So what I did was set up 3 workshops, which ran non-formal education workshops, which really aimed to support the young people to get as involved as they wanted and really take control from there of the project. Then the project became more participant-led when the young people gave presentations at festivals. They were encouraged to do social actions. They wrote short stories, peer interviews. They did workshops at international policy conferences, developed a film, and there was a lot of one-to-one meetings between us as well. They also ran informal group meetings where we cooked together. The young people decided what we would eat, what we would do, what we would talk about. And these were in the young people's houses. And this was more co-management, and the follow-up meetings as well. The research led again, although they were trying to be as participatory and inclusive as possible. We had 12 in-depth interviews, and then there was dissemination at 2 academic events, which were not so appropriate for the young people to participate in. And then partner-led were youth events that the young people and policy conference that the young people participated in. And I've recently finished member checks and follow-ups with the young people, and I just got back yesterday from France. So it's been a bit of an interesting one, particularly with COVID. So it changed a little bit how that all worked. But just to kind of, I think I was thinking about what Mary was talking about earlier and what we're talking about in the groups. One of the things I was thinking about in regards to power was power and power and how to really run a project properly, and not properly, but in the most supportive way for the young people and not to overreach my claims. So I was looking at some of the critiques. I'm not going to go through them all, but some of the things that, in the literature we talk about is that power being more empowerly or ethically better than other research traditions, or that we will inevitably have empowerment when we use power, or claims that the research is empowering in spite of the fact that it's very managed and controlled by the researcher. Other things like theorizing agency and power is something that we can give, for example, young people, or that power is conceptualized as something repressive and that it's known to the researcher, even though that there may be hidden power dynamics. And that's something that, for example, us as researchers, we can give up. So, and in regards to separated young people specifically, one of the things was that young people are repeatedly labeled as vulnerable in the literature and by organizations and often by themselves. and they've often been depicted as passive agents and the other. And Chase, in their study on separated asylum-seeking children, emphasized the impact of hidden power dynamics on young people, on the young people in the study, and that research today has often failed to consider these impacts. So from there, what I was hoping to do was to make sure that I was taking this into consideration. So power was really used so that we do understand that the perspectives and of the separated young people and take into account their experiences. In the French literature, that I couldn't find any except for any research past 2010. There's one paper in 2010 that actually looked at the young people's experiences and worked directly with them. The rest is with social workers and things like this. So there was very, very little there. So what I wanted to do is recognize and address the various power dynamics, structures, and privilege in the research process. And to do that, I had to develop a number of different strategies. I'm not going to talk to you about all of them because there was so many things that came up. But what I want to talk about is addressing power and privilege in the process. So firstly, I tried to acknowledge the microphysics of power and power structure. So how power hierarchies appeared within and as a result of the power processes, and particularly the unintentional hierarchical power issues, but also the social, political, and historical conditions that impacted on my knowledge development in the process, including my own privilege. So, for example, I'm a white, well-educated European woman, and I had to recognize this in the process. So what I recognize is that although its power is dynamic, it's contextual, uneven, and inevitable, and implicated in all spaces and positions, and that my privilege can't be taken away or reduced, even if my own values reject it and reject the hierarchical practices that are there. So what I did, I used reflexivity and critical reflectivity in all stages in the research process. And for example, typically used reflective journaling and memo writing. I invited participants to provide feedback on the research process at all stages in the research process, and informally, for example, before the research process began. For example, other separated young people who weren't necessarily involved yet. I also invited peers and gatekeepers to support and advise on different issues and challenges. And I found that this was particularly important for the fact that also I was not in Ireland. So my research was in France, and I was in France for the guts of a year. So for having the peers and the different gatekeepers who were on the ground to support me and at a distance really, really helped. But what I want to talk about specifically is the guiding principles that I use for reflection. And this is something that Mary's written a lot about, and I've really drawn from her work, and I'd really recommend that everyone has a look at it. So I use the structured ethical reflection model which focuses on social justice, the distribution and the manipulation of power, and co-generation of knowledge. So these are all things that I really put central in my own research process and in the aims and what we were hoping to do in the research. So in addition to the formal institutional ethical processes, I incorporated the SER, the structural ethical reflection, which aim to make value-based decision-making in each stage of the research process, but also more fully consider and address the complex ethical implications and challenges which came up almost every day and that I could not have foreseen. So there's so many things that I thought I would foresee, but most of them came up completely, got me out of whack. So I hadn't planned most of them at all. So it really helped me trying to quickly make decisions based on the values of the study and of my own values and the participants too. So the first person, it's primarily a first person process. That's how I used it anyway. And started with, my first step was identifying my own ethical values that were important for my research practice. I established 14 key themes, and several themes were often coupled together. So I found that I tried to get it down to the 7 that I hoped, but I had 14 at the start because I couldn't get it any closer. I had too many, but then start to group them together. The ethical reflection remained unfinished until after the participatory group project began, because I wanted the participants to be involved and include their own ethical principles and values into the process. So what we had done at the start of the non-formal workshops back in November 2018, we developed a group agreement, and this basically set out the key principles and values, including respect, mutual respect, inclusivity, solidarity, support, and things like this, as well as logistical aspects of the project that we would all follow for the whole research project. So I incorporated them into the themes guiding the principles, and I incorporated them into the principles and tried to use them to finalize the themes. So finally, I got down to 7 core principles, and these included mutual respect, solidarity and trust, love, authenticity and transparency, rigor and conscientiousness, inclusiveness, and social justice. And from there, I developed a structured ethical reflection grid. And this basically laid out a number of different questions. And it wasn't everything, but it included the key questions that helped me to mainstream the key values into each stage of the research process, and with certain sections containing lots of different questions, so that they could invoke a more critical and ethical reflection throughout the research process. So Mary talked about this. So the kind of key questions that we ask ourselves is there immediate danger? Is there something? Are the participants being put at the center of the process, etc., etc.? So I'm going to talk a little bit about one example. What we talked about earlier, what Mary gave in the case study, was also something that came up for me, but I haven't actually included it here because we talked a lot about it earlier. But something that I found was challenging power plays that came up due to my own privilege and positionality, and I found it difficult sometimes to navigate my own role in the research process. So sometimes I was jumping from a researcher to a facilitator. Am I being too close? Am I crossing boundaries? Am I becoming too much of a friend or a crutch sometimes? And things like this. But within the process, and as the young people became increasingly take ownership of the process and take more responsibility, I found it was actually hard to negotiate my own role and I think my own positionality within the project. I sometimes became frustrated and questioned the dynamics of the group. For example, as the process became more informal, we were eating together. One evening, for example, we met at I think 4 p.m. and we hadn't done any work, and it was 9 p.m. and I was wondering, when are we going to do anything? And nothing was happening. We were just chatting. It was very, very informal. And this happened for a few weeks, and I started to think, okay, I want to take more lead. I want to drive this process forward faster and more concretely. And I really found myself struggling. What should I do? And I'm kind of struggling with my own way of being. So what I did, I was journaling. Every time I had a meeting, I journaled. And I also used the grid and the questions as a kind of compass for my own values and a compass for my research practice. What kind of actions should I take and where should I go with it? So I reflected particularly on the theme of inclusiveness, and for example, asked myself, is space being made to ensure that the participants' needs are met? Do I need to step back and leave the participants to figure it out? Is the process participant-led, and what is my role in the research, and does my role need to shift? So these were all things I was thinking about. And what I ended up doing, so I realized that actually, despite thinking that things could be achieved faster or more quickly, I decided that it's the participants need to be taking, I need to support the participants to take control of the process and to do it in their own way and at their own pace. I could have changed things, but I don't think they would have appreciated it. And I think that the research process would have been compromised and it would have been going away from my own values and the values of the participants. And due to this, I actually ended up with the participants adapting the methods. So we became to develop a more meaningful participant engagement with all aspects of the research process. And more informal places actually ended up being created instead of less. So we ate together, reflected, chatted, and more than I actually had been doing earlier. The informal setting supported an environment of active participation and sharing, But actually, when I look back on it, which was something I was worrying about, because you all have your interests when you're doing the research, and I was worried, would I get a PhD in the end of it as well? That I actually had a very, very rich data set, and much more was coming out of the informal sessions than I actually had realized before I started journaling. So, and in addition to this, the informal discussion supporting the identification of key themes.
I'm going to, sorry, interrupt just and say 1 minute left, Amy.
Perfect. I'll be finishing up in 1 minute. Perfect. And ensure the correct interpretation of data. So I managed, it actually helped having these informal discussions. So instead of hindering the process, it actually made it better. So just some of the learnings, the PAR process was more important than the research output. So I found that the process itself was more important, and sometimes this is something that's easy to forget. And that keeping the role of facilitator and supporting the participants better serve the participants and their needs. But what also hit me is that even though I didn't necessarily want the privilege, I couldn't forget that I had it. So I had the choice of saying, okay, I can become a facilitator or I become a leader. So you can't deny that I had, my privilege was still there. So I was trying to find ways of, I suppose, balancing this out. So just to conclude, young people themselves began to recognize and take actions about the power imbalances they faced during the process. And the structured ethical reflection supported me to acknowledge my own positionality and privilege, develop and implement actions that aim to address the emerging power imbalances. I avoided hindering the participant-led process, and I learned to go with the flow, to trust the process, and most importantly, to trust the participants. So a few questions for you. I was wondering, what measures have you taken in your research practice to recognize and address power and power asymmetries and differences and your own privilege in your research? And how have you incorporated your values and the participant values into the research practice? I hope I haven't gone too much over, and do ask me any questions you have as well.
Thank you very much, Amy. And there's some great comments and chat in the chat window. I'm going to keep moving things